Asterisk, high in the mountains, where the wind howls and the land stretches endlessly into the sky, a lone Mustang stands, abandoned, forgotten. His coat is covered in dust, his ribs faintly visible beneath his powerful frame. Once he had a home, a master, a life filled with purpose. But now he is alone, left to survive against the wild, against the predators lurking in the shadows, against the brutal cold of the night. But this is not a story of surrender. This is a story of survival, of strength, of a Mustang who refused to break. As hunger gnaws at his belly and the wind whispers tales of lost memories, the Mustang must make a choice: stay on this mountain and fade into the wilderness, or fight for something greater. And just when he thinks he has no reason left to hope, he hears a sound, a voice, a chance. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay with me till the end, because this Mustang's journey is far from over. Asterisk, the wind howled through the rugged mountain pass, carrying the scent of pine and the sharp chill of the high-altitude air. High above the valley, on a lonely ridge where the earth met the sky, a single Mustang stood, motionless, abandoned. His golden coat, once vibrant under the sun, was now caked with dust, his ribs faintly visible beneath his powerful frame. His ears twitched at every distant sound, his dark eyes scanning the horizon for movement, for familiarity, for the man who had once been his world. He had not always been alone. Once he had belonged to a man, a farmer named Elliot. The Mustang had been more than just a horse. He had been a companion, a partner in long days of labor, a presence that made the solitude of the ranch bearable. But the seasons had been unkind. The land had dried, the crops had failed, and the farm that had once been Elliot's legacy had become nothing more than dust and broken fences. When the time came to leave, the farmer had to make an impossible choice. A last ride into the mountains, a soft whisper of regret, a final pat on the neck, and then the fading sound of hooves retreating down the trail. The Mustang had watched, waiting for the man to turn back, to call his name, to change his mind. But he never did. The last trace of Elliot disappeared into the misty valley below, leaving the Mustang alone. The first night had been the worst. He had called out, his powerful neigh echoing off the cliffs, but only the wind answered him. He had paced a rocky ledge, the earth beneath his hooves unfamiliar and unsteady. Hunger gnawed at his belly, the cold seeped into his bones. But the worst part was the loneliness. Days passed, and the Mustang learned to fend for himself. The mountain was a harsh, unrelenting place, but he was built for survival. He found water trickling from the rocks, cold and pure. He grazed on sparse patches of grass, tough but enough to keep him moving. His muscles, once softened by ranch life, grew lean and hardened. But danger lurked in the shadows. Wolves prowled the lower slopes, their eyes glowing in the darkness. He kept to the high ridges, where the wind carried their scent before they could get close. When a mountain lion crossed his path one night, its yellow eyes locking onto him with hunger, he did not freeze, he charged. Rearing up, his hooves struck the earth, sending stones tumbling down the slope. The predator hesitated, calculating the risk, and then disappeared into the night. Yet the real battle was not with the wild. It was within. Every sunset, as the sky turned gold and crimson, he would stand at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the valley where the ranch had once been. The memories lingered. The smell of fresh hay, the warmth of a steady hand, the soft murmur of a familiar voice. But there was no going back. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, something changed. He heard something new, a distant whistle carried by the wind. His ears snapped forward, his heart pounding. It was a sound he had not heard in weeks, yet it was unmistakable. A human, the Mustang moved cautiously down the slope, his hooves steady on the uneven ground. The scent of a man grew stronger, mixed with the familiar scent of leather and dust. And then, in a clearing just below the ridge, he saw him. Not Elliot, but another man, standing beside a worn saddle, his hat pulled low, his stance patient but unthreatening. The Mustang halted, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowing. He knew what men were. Some were kind, some were cruel, but all of them had one thing in common. They left. The man didn't move closer. He simply stood there, one hand extended, palm open. He spoke, his voice low and steady, the words meaningless but the tone unmistakable. An invitation, not a command. The Mustang hesitated. He had learned to survive alone. He had outrun storms, faced down predators, conquered the loneliness of the mountain. He did not need a man, and yet a gust of wind carried the scent of something familiar. Fresh hay, a warm stable, safety. The Mustang took a step forward, then another. The man didn't rush him. He simply waited, understanding that trust was not something given. It was something earned. Finally, the Mustang stopped just within reach. The man didn't grab him, didn't force a halter onto his head. He simply rested a hand on his shoulder, light, steady, like the touch of someone who understood. For the first time in weeks, the Mustang lowered his head. Not in submission, in acceptance. The ride down the mountain was slow. The Mustang's steps measured, his body tense but willing. The man led him carefully, never pulling, never demanding. As they reached the base of the mountain, the Mustang saw something that made his heart quicken. A ranch. Not the same one he had left behind, but similar. A wide pasture stretched beyond the wooden fence, dotted with other horses grazing in the golden light of dusk. The Mustang stopped, his breath hitching as he took it all in. The man unlatched the gate and stepped aside. He didn't push the Mustang forward. He didn't have to. The Mustang hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. The earth was soft beneath his hooves. The scent of fresh hay filled his nostrils. The warmth of a new home wrapped around him like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. He was no longer abandoned. He was no longer alone. And this time, no one was going to leave him behind. The night had fallen over the valley, wrapping the land in a blanket of deep blue, interrupted only by the shimmering light of a crescent moon. The Mustang stood at the entrance of the ranch, his dark eyes scanning the open pasture before him. The scent of fresh hay lingered in the air, mingling with the distant sound of other horses grazing under the stars. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar, something he had not felt in a long time. For weeks, he had lived on that lonely mountain ridge, fighting against the wild, proving to himself that he could survive. But survival had come at a cost. Each night, he had stood on the edge of the cliff, staring down at the world he had once known, wondering if he had been forgotten, if he had ever truly belonged. The wind had carried his calls into the empty darkness, but no one had answered. Now, for the first time since being abandoned, he was faced with a different kind of decision. He had spent so long learning to live without men, without a stable, without the security of familiar hands. And yet, here he was, standing on the threshold of a place that promised warm food and perhaps something even deeper, a home. The man who had found him did not push, did not demand. He stood beside the open gate, his hands resting casually by his sides, his stance relaxed. He had seen horses like this before, wild, cautious, shaped by hardships that no human could fully understand. He knew that trust was not something that could be forced. It had to be earned, and even then, it could be taken away in an instant. The Mustang lowered his head, ears flicking forward as he took a hesitant step. The ground beneath his hooves felt different, softer than the rocky slopes of the mountain, steadier than the crumbling ledges where he had once stood alone. Another step. The wooden fence stood just ahead, separating him from the open pasture where the other horses grazed peacefully. He watched them, their bodies relaxed, their tails swaying lazily as they moved through the tall grass. They had found their place here. Could he? He turned his head slightly, looking back toward the trail that led up into the mountains. He knew that path well. It had been his home, his battleground, the place where he had learned to be truly alone. Up there, he had no one to answer to, no walls to contain him, no hands reaching for ropes or saddles. But there was also no warmth, no company, no reason to run other than for the sake of running. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply waited, allowing the Mustang to decide for himself. The Mustang exhaled, a slow, steady breath that carried away the last remnants of hesitation. Then, with one final glance at the mountains, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the ranch. The wooden gate creaked slightly as he passed, but he did not flinch. He did not look back. The other horses lifted their heads, watching his approach. There was no fear, no aggression, just quiet acknowledgement. A few flicked their ears before returning to their grazing, as if accepting his presence without question. He hesitated for only a moment before lowering his head to the grass, the first real meal he had allowed himself in weeks. The man gave a small nod, then turned away, walking back toward the house without a word. He knew that the hardest part was over. The Mustang had made his choice. The night stretched on, the world quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The Mustang stood beneath the vast sky, the stars above mirroring the flickering lanterns that lined the barn. He had once believed that freedom meant being alone, that survival meant keeping his distance. But now, he understood something new. True freedom was not just about running wild, but about choosing where to stand, choosing who to trust, choosing to belong. And for the first time in his life, he had made that choice. He was not broken. He was not tamed. He was home.